People should really hold the government to account. I think it's always important to do that. You got to remember that anyone who puts on any kind of uniform or badge that says, the United States on it, they work for us. And if they are not doing their job properly, if they are violating your rights, they need to be held accountable.
Ever wonder what really happens when your rights are violated and what you can do about it? Ever wonder what the law looks like outside of TV dramas and headlines? Meet Quinn Mayberry, a Harvard-trained trial lawyer who has helped individuals recover millions of dollars, and Alex Lobert, Quinn's lifelong friend and your law translator-in-chief, here to make the law make sense. On this show, they cover headline-making legal battles and overlook cases to show you how to fight back and win. This is Legally Curious.
So we have a treat today. Our first ever guest on Legally Curious, Alejandro Barrientos from Barrientos PC, who is a fantastic civil rights and criminal defense attorney. Alejandro, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Quinn and Alex. It's great to be here. As Quinn was just saying, I currently have my practice, Barrientos PC, here in Los Angeles, where I'm doing civil rights and criminal defense work. I used to work as a federal public defender here in Los Angeles, which is a very interesting experience. And before that, I worked at a large law firm out in DC. But I put that well in the past and I'm now focused on representing the individual, citizens of LA.
Yeah, at some point we got to get some stories about your time at the PD's, at the public defender's office.
Yeah, I don't know if I can tell all of them on camera.
All right, Alejandro, to kick it off, we wanted to talk about the killings in Minneapolis by federal agents. So as pretty much everyone I think knows, ICE officer Jonathan Ross killed Rene Goode on January 7th in Minneapolis. And then just 17 days later, another federal officer killed Alex Preti. Now, both these people were U.S. citizens. Everything was captured on video. And it seems like federal prosecutors actually declined to investigate at least Rene Goode's death. Can we maybe talk about what are the legal avenues that a family has when a federal agent kills someone? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, I'll walk us through that for sure. And it is going to be a long walk because it is a very complicated matter. So the kind of big picture is that the U.S. courts have generally tied themselves in knots to insulate federal law enforcement and federal government officials, even outside of law enforcement, from any kind of responsibility when they do things that are illegal or unconstitutional. So when someone thinks about suing law enforcement, the mechanism that probably comes to their mind, even if not this explicitly, is a federal statute called 42 USC 1983. That is a statute that lawyers use to sue the Los Angeles Police Department, the LA County Sheriff's Department. The problem with Section 1983 is that it does not apply to federal government officials. So then the question becomes, how do you sue them if not through Section 1983? And that's a particularly tough question because there's something called sovereign immunity. The federal government has a right not to be sued unless it consents to be sued. And like most people, it doesn't want to be sued and has not waived that sovereign immunity so that people can sue the government in very many circumstances. A few decades ago, back in the 70s, a Supreme Court case involving an individual named Bivens went up to the Supreme Court. And the question there was whether Bivens could sue over a search, I believe it was of their residence, a house or an apartment, by federal law enforcement. The Supreme Court said that there is an implied right to sue federal law enforcement under the Fourth Amendment. So generally speaking, the Fourth Amendment protects you against unreasonable searches and seizures. It does not expressly say, you get to sue the DEA or FBI if they violate that right, but the Supreme Court says we are reading that right into the Fourth Amendment. You would think based on that there would be pretty broad grounds to sue law enforcement or federal government officials after Bivens. You might wonder, why wouldn't that right extend beyond the Fourth Amendment to maybe the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or other constitutional rights? The problem is that after Bivens, the Supreme Court, in case after case, basically narrowed the scope of Bivens lawsuits to almost the exact facts of the Bivens case. So, such that if you're not suing over essentially the exact same set of circumstances, Bivens does not apply. And so that leaves us with the question: where do you turn if you can't turn to Bivens? And where you turn is the Federal Tort Claims Act. It is a place where the federal government has waived its sovereign immunity and allows lawsuits to be brought against the United States government. That brings you to the Federal Tort Claims Act, which does allow you to sue the federal law enforcement officers under something called the Intentional Torts Act exception, which lets you sue for assault, malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and several other things. The problem is that sometimes that exception, the intentional torts exception, can clash with another provision regarding discretionary acts. And basically, what the discretionary acts provision says is that if federal law enforcement is doing something that legally they have the discretion to do, you cannot sue them even if it is one of those things that is enumerated in the Intentional Torts Act exception. So to maybe kind of give a concrete example, let's say federal law enforcement goes to your house with the warrant, and you say that that warrant was unconstitutional, was unreasonable. There was no probable cause, for example, for that warrant to get issued. And you might say that the government, by executing that warrant, was engaging in an abusive process. The government would turn around and say, it doesn't really matter whether or not that was abusive process. The bottom line is that under federal law, we have the authority to execute search warrants. We have the discretion to execute those warrants. And so there can be this clash between the Intentional Torts Act exception and the Discretionary Act bar. There is an important disagreement between various federal courts about what you do when the Intentional Torts Act exception and the Discretionary Act bar conflict. Some courts have said if the intentional tort, so let's take assault, for example, also violates the Constitution. So a civil rights attorney might argue that a federal law enforcement officer assaulted a person, and that assault also constituted excessive force under the Fourth Amendment. And they would therefore argue that because it was unconstitutional, the law enforcement officer had no discretion to do it. And so the Discretionary Act bar does not apply. Some courts have bought and adopted that argument. Some courts have rejected it. I don't think the Supreme Court has ruled on it yet, but theoretically, at some point in the future, the Supreme Court could either essentially shut down claims under the Federal Tort Claims Act by saying that the Discretionary Bar Act will apply even if an act is unconstitutional, or it might go the other way and open up Federal Tort Claims Act claims in jurisdictions where courts have, I guess, kind of prioritized the Discretionary Act bar.
Fantastic explanation. So to the extent you're comfortable, and we can cut this if you don't want to comment on it, what do you think the Supreme Court's going to do if this circuit split makes it to them?
I would not bet on the Supreme Court to do the right thing in any case.
That is probably where the smart money is, but not what I was hoping to hear, Alejandro.
It is what it is.
All right, Alejandro, let's switch topics a little bit. How about we talk about wrongful deportations. Another light topic here today. Really, again, another very famous case was Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was deported to El Salvador's Sicat prison despite a court order protecting him. Now, the government ultimately admitted the mistake, rare for this administration, but the Supreme Court ordered his return, but then the DOJ actually charged him with human smuggling. Unsealed documents show that senior officials called the prosecution a top priority after he won his case. Can you maybe lay out for us, how does someone with a legal protection from deportation end up in a foreign mega prison?
I guess number one, how does someone respond after something like that happens or something like that is happening to them? There are a couple of ways that they might be able to get some kind of relief. One of them is a legal proceeding called habeas corpus, which I think in English means show me the body or bring me the body or something like that. Effectively saying that whenever someone is in government custody, they typically have the right to go to court and say the government is holding me unlawfully. That gets a little complicated if the government has handed someone over to a foreign government. But courts still have some methods to address those kinds of issues. One of those is just generally speaking that the courts have inherent power to enforce their orders. So, for example, in Abrego's case, as you mentioned, I think there was a court order already in place saying that this gentleman needs to stay here at least for a certain amount of time, and the government violated that. So, generally speaking, the courts don't need a particular legal mechanism. They have authority to enforce their orders. They can do that in a number of different ways. For example, they could hold government officials in contempt if they believe that the officials have, for example, been lying or willfully violating a court order. I think in the Abrego case, the government had a number of excuses about why they thought maybe they made a mistake. I think those were very, very thin excuses. And I know courts are, as a general matter, looking a lot more skeptically at assertions made by the government in connection with especially high-profile cases like the Abrego case.
So to what extent do you see courts actually holding the government's, feet to the fire here and saying, if you're violating these court orders, we're going to hold you in contempt?
It's tough because traditionally the federal government and attorneys for the federal government are given a lot of leeway and a lot of, confidence that is not extended towards the typical person who is litigating in court. Sometimes that is actually formalized in law. For example, there are often presumptions that what the government is doing is correct, is lawful, and if you're challenging that, you have to overcome it. Another, outside of the law and kind of formal recognitions of the government or formal deference to the government is a lot of federal judges, the federal bench, comes from government. A lot of former U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys, other attorneys who worked for the federal government in some capacity. And so what you have at the end of the day is kind of an institutional bent in favor of the government, of the federal government. So I think it is very difficult in a lot of cases to say that the government is acting in bad faith and to get courts to really scrutinize the government. However, I do think that is changing with the current administration, where the administration is taking a lot of positions that are not defensible. And you see that because a lot of attorneys are leaving government practice, right? So you have assistant U.S. attorneys who are leaving offices. You have DOJ attorneys who are leaving offices in a lot of cases because they do not feel that they can, with a straight face, defend the positions that the government is asking it to defend. And actually, I don't know if you'll heard, but there was recently a case, I'm forgetting from where, but I think it was an immigration case where a government attorney basically admitted to the court that what they were doing was indefensible and actually asked the court to hold, the attorney asked the court to hold herself in contempt because she thought that would be a way for her to kind of escape, I guess, what she thought was a situation she couldn't otherwise escape. So with things like that happening, I think courts will scrutinize the government a lot more.
Yeah, I saw that she was recently let go. Might not come as a huge surprise to anybody, but
I will say to the government attorneys out there, you can always quit. You don't have to hold yourself in contempt. You can just quit.
There's easier ways. I think that one, she was asking to be held in contempt so she could get a good night's sleep. So backlogged with all these resignations. It's it's a level of chaos that you don't typically see from the Department of Justice. But so Alejandro, let's talk about in extreme situations, if it's really hard for the government to be held to account through normal channels, I mean, are there private rights of action? What could possibly be done here?
Well, we were just talking about the Federal Tort Claims Act. You can sue for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. It's actually would probably be fairly difficult to bring those kinds of claims where you're talking about a deportation, in part because you can sue over law enforcement. So, for example, DHS or ICE. However, you're not able to sue the U.S. Attorney's Office, for example, or attorneys in the U.S. Attorney's Office under the Federal Tort Claims Act. So that could be a bar. But, at the end of the day, what you can always do is if a court order has been violated, you can ask the court to hold the government or the government attorneys in contempt or other government actors in contempt. You can also ask for sanctions if the government is insisting on pursuing a legal position that is frivolous.
And while sanctions are oftentimes hard to get, I think we've seen an increased willingness to take actions that the court otherwise wouldn't because of the extreme nature of some of these violations. Do you think that's fair to say?
I do think that's fair. I think we've seen from a lot of courts, at the very least, orders to show cause why there shouldn't be sanctions issued for, any number of different litigation positions or actions that have been taken by the government. So just the fact that a court says you need to tell me why I shouldn't issue sanctions is itself at least a warning shot to the government that it needs to correct whatever it's doing.
So I'd love to ask one dumb question here. Is it legal for the government to essentially send you to a prison in another country? What is like? Can you explain to me? Just like at the base here, is that something that
you're
the
not
government
going to
do?
like the answer, Alex?
Well, I would argue not. Especially when we talk about the CCOT, prison, for example, where there's been plenty of reporting about how unsafe that particular prison is. I know there'd also been reporting about the government attempting to send people to countries that they had no connection to. And I would say that is illegal, especially where there is some reason for the government to know or believe that the person that they're removing from this country will be in danger in the place that they're sending them to. That kind of comes from there's a lot of cases, at least like out in California in the Ninth Circuit, and that basically say the government can't just dump you in a situation that it knows it's dangerous. And I'm blanking on the name of the case, but the basic situation was that I think it was, I don't know if it was LAPD, but it was some local police officer released somebody on some road late at night that was dangerous. I don't remember if it was like a high crime area or something like that. And then something happened to that person. Maybe they were assaulted or hit by a car or something like that. But the bottom line was that the Ninth Circuit said the government can't just knowingly dump you in a dangerous place. I think that line of reasoning should extend to things like removals from the United States to other countries. And, it comes up not just in immigration cases, but in other types of cases. So, for example, international extradition, right? You might think that someone who is in the United States and some foreign country is trying to have them extradited to a place that might be dangerous. You might think that they would be able to challenge that in federal court. It's actually like very, very difficult to do. But I think the basic reasoning that the government cannot just, dump you in a place where you're going to be assaulted, where you're going to be tortured, where your ability to survive because of, lack of water, lack of food, or whatever else. The government shouldn't be able to just drop you there.
Does it matter if you are or are not a U.S. citizen in that context?
It can. I don't know that it should. I don't want to get too far afield into, discussion about like birthright citizenship or what constitutional rights non-citizens should have. I think it's enough to say that the Supreme Court has said that even if you do not have lawful status here, if you have a sufficiently strong connection to the country, you do get constitutional protections, or at least some constitutional protections. And I think that is right and should probably be broadened out.
Worth noting that, Scalia has said as much, a very conservative past Supreme Court justice, has made clear that in prior opinions that non-citizens have certain rights, at least while they're on American soil, whether or not they're American citizens.
And I just want to throw this out there as hypothetical for us all to ball over, right? If I'm a UK citizen and I come to the United States, I can't be just taken and sent to CCOT, right? That just sounds insane. To say. But I suppose. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm just trying to think of the way I could think of this from a different perspective, because I think we always take the perspective of someone's here from a Central American country, and and that is their. And they've been here illegally. However, people come to the United States all the time that are not U.S. citizens. And it seems patently crazy to me. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but that those people would have zero rights in that situation.
And you've seen tourism numbers drop off precipitously. And it's partially because of this very concern. So is that illegal? To Alejandro's point, I think yes, it absolutely should be. I would go as far as to say it probably is. But just diving into a jurisprudence course here, it's the rule of law is about what a piece of paper says and what the enforcement is. And so if there's not a whole lot of enforcement for those violations, or maybe going as far as to say none at all, then the answer becomes de facto, yes, they could do that, right?
Yeah, it is true.
Tell me where I'm wrong, Alejandro.
Yeah, if the government just does it, even if it's illegal, and then the person whose rights are being violated is now removed from the country, and maybe they can't get a lawyer, and the wrong has just gone unpunished or unaddressed, and unless the person comes back and somehow, gets an attorney, maybe it never gets addressed. I think something else to keep in mind, though, is that there are other protections outside of the Constitution. So, there are legal avenues for asylum. There's the Convention Against Torture, which also has some restrictions on where you can send people if you're removing them from your country. So it's not just about the Constitution. There are other legal prohibitions that, sometimes they're stronger, sometimes they're weaker. But a lot of times I think the government is trying to get around them, unfortunately.
So in the wrongful deportation context, there are maybe fairly limited options. There are some levers that could be pulled, but let's talk about where people might have the strongest claims when they have been wronged, in the immigration enforcement context more broadly. So let's talk about things like excessive force again.
Yeah. So kind of going back to, the issue of, ICE agents assaulting people, shooting people, especially those folks who are, just protesting or just bystanders who kind of get caught up in a situation. Those folks generally should be able to sue under the Federal Tort Claims Act for assault. And if they are injured, they are able to go to a judge for a trial, and they can ask the judge to compensate them, pay for medical bills, pay for pain and suffering, all of these things they can try to get in compensation from the federal government. Unfortunately, the one thing that they can't get is punitive damages. So even if you have a case where, law enforcement is very plainly acting outside the law and intentionally, for example, with Rene Goode, I think there was a captured statement by the officer where he called her a bitch or something like that. Even if you have cases like that where there's very strong evidence that law enforcement is acting out of spite, you cannot get punitive damages. I think that's somewhere where the law needs to be changed, though.
Nevertheless, though, I would expect to see plenty of 7- and 8-figure verdicts and settlements coming out of some of these tort claims. I mean, what do you think? Is that fair to say, Alejandro?
I mean, where you have cases where people are being shot, and there are quite a few of those, including here in LA, I do think that is reasonable to expect. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in this situation where we've acknowledged there's a very high bar to bringing some of these claims, there is an avenue for legal recourse in pursuing these private rights of action where there is this really excessive force. I just don't want anybody to leave the episode thinking, this is a tough situation, not a lot to be done. There's some truth to that, but there also are avenues forward, right?
That's right.
In this last segment, I want to talk a little bit about vindictive prosecution. We've seen patterns from the Department of Justice where there are attorneys in Washington, very senior attorneys, signing indictments where that would typically be done by, a local staff attorney, but they're refusing to do so because they don't believe there's sufficient evidence. There are statements from the president himself and other senior officials suggesting that prosecution should be brought against, sometimes political actors like the New York Attorney General, other times against, individuals where they've been caught in crosshairs, essentially. What do you think about the viability of those claims? I guess let's start there. Yeah. What do you think about the viability of those claims?
Yeah, I think there are likely a fair number of viable claims there. So as kind of background, vindictive prosecution, also sometimes referred to as selective prosecution, comes into play in both the criminal side and the civil side. So you can actually move to dismiss a criminal indictment on the grounds that the prosecutors or law enforcement are targeting you for an improper reason. So, for example, in the ICE protest case, if you believe the prosecutor is targeting you because you oppose the actions of ICE, you could challenge your indictment on that basis. And then moving over to the civil side, that does fit fairly neatly into the Federal Tort Claims Act, provisions that allow you to sue for malicious prosecution or abuse of process.
Yeah. And so, I mean, are there any specific fact patterns that come to mind, or pieces of evidence that you would introduce in a case like this? I mean, I know we've seen some of these statements that seem kind of inflammatory or.
Yeah, I think the most obvious cases are ones where ICE agents or DHS agents or other law enforcement are clearly lying So, for example, we've seen a number of complaints where if you look at what has been written by an officer and then you look at video of what happened, a lot of reasonable people would infer that the officer was lying. That fits very neatly into a abuse of process or malicious prosecution claim, where you can say this person is, you can reasonably claim that this officer is making things up because they disagree with your political views, or they have been pressured by a prosecutor who disagrees with your political views.
And could you walk us through maybe really quickly a fact pattern? So would that be, they claim you're resisting arrest and they charge you with that as an excuse to use force, or they saw you at a protest? I mean, just what are some archetypal fact patterns here? Yeah,
totally. I think what we're seeing a lot of is cases where people are charged with assaulting a federal officer. So they're, a person is protesting, they get into a scuffle with law enforcement. They are charged with assaulting an officer. The officer claims that the protester initiated contact, the physical contact, and then you look at the video and that's not true.
Well, so I guess, what do you think? Any closing thoughts, Alejandro?
Yeah, I guess, people should really hold the government to account. I think it's always important to do that. You got to remember that anyone who puts on any kind of uniform or badge that says, the United States on it, they work for us. And if they are not doing their job properly, if they are violating your rights, they need to be held accountable.
Alejandro, couldn't agree more. And by the way, this has been like a joy for me.
Man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. I joked off camera that did we get Neil Katyal to come and do our pod? But it really shows your expertise on this topic. And I think that it's been really helpful for everyone listening. So thank you. And also, where can people find you?
Well, thanks so much, guys. It was a pleasure to come and talk. I love getting to nerd out on the law stuff. Folks can find me my firm website, www.bts.law.
Amazing.
Right. Well, thanks again. And Alejandro, we will absolutely have you back on. I hate to say that. I want to talk to you again, but it's going to be for terrible reasons. But we're absolutely going to have you back on.
Sounds good.
Yeah, we don't have any choice in the matter. The regime is forcing our hand.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure.
All right, brother. Thanks for being here.
If your rights have been violated, give Mayberry Law a call at 310-776-3764. It's free, and we would love to discuss what you can do. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or create an attorney-client relationship. For specific legal guidance, consult a qualified attorney.
I 100% think you should record law enforcement or any government official when they are doing something inappropriate. Catch them on their bullshit and bring it out.
And that is a constitutionally protected activity.
That's right. Generally speaking, it is protected. You obviously can't, grab your camera and, hop in front of or impede a law enforcement officer to record them. But as long as you're not doing something like that, if you're standing back and recording from a distance without interfering, generally that's going to be protected.